I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I'm speaking with Rick Tumlinson, longtime space advocate and space business expert. Among his many achievements, Rick is the founder of the Space Frontier Foundation, a founding trustee of the X Prize organization, and has been named one of the top 100 most influential people in the space field by Space News. Now, Rick is joining us from a car, so he may be breaking up just a little bit now and then, but I'm wondering if you could start out by telling us a little bit about your background and the achievements that you're most proud of.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll be proud of myself if I can make it through LA traffic. That'll be really good. We're trying to get off the planet, and sometimes it's harrowing just get, a few miles in one of our cities. Well, I don't know. I'm just proud that I've been able to associate in this field for so long. It's been a bit of a long struggle. We come from the background of believing that humanity should expand beyond the planet, and it's taken a while to get to a point where that is sort of becoming a gradually accepted and now to some degree almost officially accepted point of view in our government space program, at least. I'm very proud of the chances I've had to speak to the Senate and Congress. I guess the biggest thing that we were able to accomplish was I was lucky enough to be the guy who shook Dennis Tito's hand that led to him flying aboard the space station a few years ago, and that was all part of a deal we had done to take over the Russian Mir space station, and we had a battle royal with the U.S. government over that, and which is written up very well, by the way, in a book called NASA Lost in Space by Greg Clerks, Klerx, and he follows the story of our war with then Administrator Dan Golden. We lost, of course, but I am, like I say, I'm one of the few people on Earth that has held title, along with a few others, to actually has owned a space station for any period of time. So that was kind of fun. But mostly I'm just proud to be able to work with these incredible people in this field that are making such breakthroughs in what I call the new space industry, or what we used to call the alternative space industry, where you see lots of new companies trying all kinds of new things to, shall we say, and I guess in terms of this, you'll break the bounds of gravity, although maybe in a little more traditional mode than you may like, but at least it's a first step.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the term alternative space industry, because one of the things that I've really been perceiving this as lately, and I could be way off base, but it seems like there's almost a ratcheting effect, and I think that's in science in general, but we're definitely seeing it in space now, where the speculative or the R&D technologies of today become the established technologies tomorrow, and then, maybe 100 years from now become the things we're trying to replace. Now, I think that the NASA approach, the big government space program, is probably more in that super mainstream, mode that's, I don't know, maybe on its way out, or at least changing its role. And the private space industries, the things that you've struggled for decades to make happen, are now moving into that leadership position. So I think it is interesting to see the alternative space community becoming mainstream. And, my hope is opening up that R&D area for maybe anti-gravity.
Yeah, it's we called it alternative a few years ago to differentiate ourselves. But then, as often happens to quote-unquote alternative bands, they become mainstream when they cross over. And around the time of the Barutan flights last year, we sort of felt we were crossing over. Plus, also, when you get down to the pragmatic sense of getting people to invest in things, we wanted to move to a different name, and that's what we call a new space. However, addressing your question more directly, I think that there are two things I want to say about the relationship between the government and the private sector. The government itself, in its main activity regarding space, has been very centralized, and I'll come back in a minute and give you a couple of definitions of the different kinds of space activities going on. But it has been very centralized, very command economy oriented, and very much non-participatory. However, I will give them credit in that as big as the budget is, inevitably some small dollars do trickle out at the end of the bell curve and end up going into some very interesting sorts of research. And so, again, I will give them credit for that. There are scientists who have been able in their spare time or, in the back room of their laboratories to be doing some very novel research and looking into some leading edge things. And to continue that thought a little bit, it takes a while for ideas to get adopted. As Arthur C. Clarke once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So a lot of the ideas that begin to percolate into the mainstream start out on the fringe and work their way to the middle. I think that is possibly the case with research on ways of working with manipulating the gravitational force. And I think that we are entering an intellectual renaissance now, because what happens is when an establishment is shaken and the walls are broken down a bit, as is happening with NASA right now, and the concept of people entering space, what it does is it creates a clearing and gives rise to the possibility for lots of people with lots of ideas to enter the field. And we're starting to see that now in propulsion and transportation technologies. However, the first wave, quite often, will not be all that different from those who had built the walls. So what we're seeing now are advancements on rocket technology. But as these current rocket technologies allow more and more people to access space, the demand for less and less cost and more access is going to go up. And that will propel research into alternative technologies, the new alternative technologies, which are the types of work you advocate.
Absolutely. Well, on the subject of leadership in the space industry, my impression really is that for the first time ever, the public is looking at organizations other than just NASA for breakthrough space achievements. Now, among other things, you've written an interesting editorial about NASA's Mike Griffin, and I'm wondering if you could contrast his approach against some of the private sector activists participating right now in these emerging space endeavors.
Well, it's interesting. I just wrote a letter to the editor to follow up my editorial, which appeared last week, in which what I was doing was I was questioning. Mike Griffin has some very interesting credentials. He has been involved in some very innovative space projects. He's probably the first administrator that I've had any hope for in probably, since I've been involved in the cause. And he's worked in private industry. He comes philosophically from the point of view of opening space to humanity, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was when he got in there, he started to consolidate, and he made some statements to people in NASA and others that sort of scared some of us out here in the movement, in that he was talking more about control, and taking over a lot of activities that had been contracted out. He canceled a few innovative contracts that were out there. So I wrote a letter that wasn't really a shot across the bow, but it was sort of a quizzical inquiry into whether he was doing what he was doing because he believed in sort of the programmatic state-controlled space program, or perhaps he was just getting his act together and handling his core job. Now, Griffin has made it clear, and I quoted a letter that he had sent to me privately that I had clearance to talk about, but he had made it clear he felt he has a mandate from President Bush to return us to the moon and go on to Mars. And he's going to do whatever it takes to make that happen. That is his core mandate. However, underlying that is the presumption that is an asserted presumption that in order to make that permanent, you have to have a strong commercial economic infrastructure. Otherwise, it becomes a long-term charity, and should the whims of the taxpayers change, just as happened with Apollo, you're left with a dead end.
Sure.
So, yeah, and so I kind of posed that question. Very interestingly, 2 days later at a breakfast for the Space Transportation Association in Washington, Griffin popped up with a major announcement that he is going to transform all of the contracting methods that are used to support the current space station in a way that will act to catalyze the private sector. Now, I was stunned, and so was the movement. The internet was flaming with a lot of people trying to understand what this all meant. But if I can give you a context for that, what's going on there is space station, which my organization fought down to one vote in the 90s as being a potential boondoggle, and we won't say we told you so, but we told you so, in the end has become an albatross around NASA's neck, and never should have been built the way it was built. And as they prepare to go to the moon and Mars, they're trying to divest themselves of that. They're planning to get out from under it. Well, there are political and economic realities here that they have to deal with. One is, having spent years, shall we say, fibbing to Congress to get the funding, it would be, at a minimum, indelicate for them to go back to Congress to try and get money to go to Moon and Mars if they should abandon this $100 billion edifice they've got up there. So, what we had proposed was that NASA use the space station, and I first proposed this in front of the House Space Subcommittee in '95, use the space station as a market maker, a purchaser of goods and services. And that the space station then could become sort of the grain of sand around which the pearl is created in the oyster, or another way to put it is, lemonade from lemons. And so the idea is that NASA will move away from the shuttle servicing the space station because, again, it's not central to his role, which is exactly what he has said in public. He has to take care of his central role, but he's pro-commercial in his heart. So what he's going to be doing is allowing these new companies, the SpaceX's, the Kisslers, the T-Space company, Constellation Services, Space Development, other companies, to vie for and build new rocket ships that can carry passengers to and equipment and supplies to and from station. What this does is adds another revenue stream to their commercial activities where they want to carry civilians into orbit. And what we may well see then, within 10 to 15 years, I predict, I'll do it on your show first, that we will have a minimum of 2 space stations in orbit, possibly 3 if the Chinese get something up. One will be Bob Bigelow's space station. He's the owner of Budget Suites of America. We will have 2 or 3 companies capable of carrying human beings to and from orbit beyond the companies that are serving NASA's needs. We will have the first human beings in several decades back on the moon. I predict they will be on the south pole of the moon where the resources are available to build a longer-term community and for resource utilization. And there will be regular flights to these facilities going on all the time. And I predict that with not a lot of certainty, a deal of confidence.
Sure. Well, you heard it here first, Ben. But now, on the subject of human settlements, the moon really does seem achievable in terms of the NASA mission. I know I'm going back a bit, but I want to touch on some personal worries that I've had about how difficult it's going to be for even a short-term mission to Mars. And in 2004, you were one of only 20 guests invited by the Bush White House to hear the president announce his plans to return to the moon and then explore Mars. So I guess I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this event and offer any thoughts on how difficult it's really going to be to get a manned mission to Mars and to keep it there for any length of time.
Yeah, just a short, funny story there on About 6 o'clock in the morning, one day, earlier this last year, I got a call from a guy named Chip, who said he was calling from the White House and wanted me to come attend the president's speech the next day. I hung up on him. I thought it was one of my East Coast friends teasing me for the fact that it seems like we sleep late on the West Coast. Later, I checked my caller ID and realized it was a White House number and scrambled and got there. I looked at the president's eyes when he gave that speech, and I believe he meant what he said. You'll notice that he didn't make it a campaign issue. You'll notice that he hasn't raised it very high in profile so that it's not being attacked, but it has caused a profound change in our community and a profound set of changes within the structure of NASA. He made this announcement at a time when the agency was weak, post-Columbia, which is a perfect time to try and transform an institution. And the Aldrich Commission came in after that he had appointed and said they needed private infrastructure. And then along came Griffin to beginning to put the pieces in place to make it happen. They can't do it with the current budget, and they're probably not going to get much more money. So that forces them, we believe, to begin using the private sector and create a partnership, sort of that you might have seen between, let's say, with NASA playing the role of Lewis and Clark, and the private sector being the settlers and shopkeepers and providers of goods and services. And by the way, the ultimate benefactor of the Lewis and Clark function is, of course, the culture that moves in behind it. Regarding Mars, there are some people who say, let's just go shoot off to Mars. Well, it's a bridge too far right now. What is often ignored by people who promote that concept is that without a vibrant, shall we say, coastal infrastructure, human beings on Mars would be unsupportable in the long term. And so in the end, what you've ended up with is flags and footprints, except it's red dirt that they're in this time.
Sure. The Lewis and Clark example that you used is interesting. I had used that in a story about anti-gravity, and the approach that I had taken with it was, I think, very similar, that rocket technology can get us to Mars, and we can do a Lewis and Clark approach where we may be able to stay there for a few weeks to maybe even a few years. But I really felt like Lewis and Clark, in their expedition, they were able to do the exploration, but they weren't able to do any real settlement. And I felt like anti-gravity in this context, or at least my hope, and I think from what we're seeing, I think that's going to be supported, is that anti-gravity can become the railroad that carries the settlers. So, again, a little bit later out in time, but, perhaps more profound and long-term impact.
Well, I would give you maybe a slightly different analogy in that at first the settlers depended on things like Conestoga wagons and barges through canals and mules and other, shall we say, biological or natural technologies to carry their goods and services back and forth and themselves to and from the frontier. And what's interesting is I'm actually reading a book, Undaunted Courage, on Lewis and Clark right now, and by Stephen Ambrose, and he makes the point in there, which it takes a moment to really get this, but if you think about it, up until the development of the steam engine, which occurred after Lewis and Clark, the fastest modes of transportation were only those things that could be driven by organic or natural engines, be they the human body, animal labor, perhaps wind. And that nothing on Earth moved faster than a horse could gallop, and hadn't moved faster than a horse could gallop from the beginning of recorded history. So that the people in 1800, who were the first to enter the frontier, were really no better off in their transportation than the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians. And yet they were moving into the frontier. The opening of that frontier then drove with great rapidity an intellectual renaissance in the continuation of the Enlightenment, B, massive breakthroughs in technological development that were needed to support it by doing things such as applying steam engines to moving payloads around, which then increased the average speed, which then moved you into the world of using combustion energy. And combustion energy carries us through this era in the sense of jet aircraft, rockets, etc. So, given that history and technology seems to progress very quickly, and you see a halving or a quartering or whatever of time between technological developments, since we are now in the age of combustion and have been there for, let's say, 200 years, I would say within the next 100 years, the next level of use of energy for movement of people will come online. And that may well be gravitationally based manipulation of gravity. So you might be completely on track.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the real benefits lately have been from string theory and more recently brain theory. And I know this is kind of off on a technical bent, but I think what we're actually seeing is kind of a profound and yet subtle transition in the way that mainstream science looks at the world. And I'd like to think that the alternative sciences have been there for decades, but I think that the salient point there is that we're seeing a shift in our consciousness to be able to look at things like maybe faster than light drives, definitely gravity control, and a host of seemingly impossible technologies in a new light, and being able to look at those more optimistically than they've been looked at in the past.
I totally agree. Again, as to my previous analogies, keep in mind the Greeks had steam engines. They didn't know what to do with them. They thought they were toys. It took the combination of changes in attitude, changes in belief sets, changes in the opportunities afforded to people who had had those changes in attitude and belief sets, all of this at the same time in history for the breakthroughs to occur to where somebody said, oh, I could hook a steam engine up to this and it'll do that. People have been playing on the fringes of what we call science today for a long time, and I agree with you. I think that our mentality is actually changing. The wiring in our brain that we use to interpret the universe around us is actually undergoing changes, and those changes allow us to interpret the nature of reality itself differently. And I think we are headed in a really strong direction.
Well, now, in terms of that wiring, you've suggested in the past that most space activists traditionally fall into one of three categories, which you've defined as Saganites, Gerard K. O'Neillians, and then von Braunians. I'm wondering if you could describe what those categories mean so that our audience can kind of maybe, determine where they fit.
Okay. Some people remember Sagan as a big proponent of sending people to Mars. Actually, most of his career he was against humans going into space, and was for sending robots, or what I derogatorily refer to as toasters. The Saganites are people who, they look at space and it's big with billions and billions of stars. It's be proud, be excited, be worshipful of this great and incredible universe. Look at it, study it, but don't touch it. So they're sort of cosmic voyeurs. That would be pure scientists, astronomers, the Planetary Society to a large degree, JPL, those people who want to send robotic explorers instead of humans, those kind of things. Nothing wrong with that. That's great. I'm not indicting that field at all. I support pure science as much as I possibly can. I just want to have people living there when they're doing the science. Then there's the von Braunians. Von Braunians came from von Braun and the Germans, the Nazis we brought over after World War II, who were used to sort of a state-centralist approach. They were, space is something we will conquer. We will thrust bombs out into space. The conquest of space is upon us, and with your tax dollars will pay for the state to build very large rockets that we will go out and you will sit on your couches and you will be very proud of your government for opening space for you. That is very much a command economy government approach. That's what we have today, or up until recently, well, actually still in our government space program at NASA and the military.
Sure. So far you've outlined the Carl Sagan approach, which is this hands-off voyeur, majestic grandeur of space, and then the von Braun approach, which is really just the kind of the mainstream NASA approach. Then the big government project that people can watch on TV. Now Gerard K. O'Neill, who you actually worked for a while back, he had a different approach, which was actually towards human settlement, didn't he?
Absolutely. Gerard O'Neill was a fellow who during the turmoil of the late 60s, early 70s as a professor at Princeton, he posed to his physics class a question about whether humanity, being on the surface of the world, was the best place to be to develop. The answer came back no. He wrote a book called The High Frontier. Dr. O'Neill posed the idea that his approach was use your imagination, the tools you have at hand, and the resources you find in space, and expand humanity and life itself beyond the Earth. And he was a very gentle guy, and also he took that philosophy and he applied it in the form of the Space Studies Institute, which then sprung a group called the L5 Society, came from there, et cetera, et cetera. And what Jerry did was he said, you go do it. Don't wait for somebody else. He was very empowering that way, so that he would take idiots like myself and let us get involved in actual projects. In fact, he had a circle of acolytes around him who are at the core, many of them, of the current new space movement. Peter Diamandis of the X Prize, Todd Hawley, who we lost a few years ago, they've co-founded the International Space University. Eric Drexler, the founder of Nanotech, works for Jerry O'Neill. I was there. We used to call ourselves Jerry's kids. And we talked about what we call the benevolent conspiracy to go out into the world over, and we knew it would take a couple of, more decades, and begin transforming the way we think and do space, so that people get out there and do it themselves. And so, what we see now, in the form of all these new space companies, are people who are, in essence, O'Neillians. And O'Neillians are, again, these people who are out doing it. They're not waiting for the government. They're putting their own sweat and money into it, and they're going to make it happen. So I'm very, very excited because right now the confluence of events is we have a government that has said they want to go into space permanently, and we have a private sector led by these O'Neillians who want to go out and do it with their money. And the combination of those forces has never occurred in human history before. So it's a great time.
Sure. Well, the legislation that's been out there so far has really kind of said unequivocally that space belongs to everyone. And I really think that everyone does include the public. So having these publicly accessible companies and really, open access to space for the public is really the direction to drive in. And in some ways almost leads to maybe a new type of manifest destiny.
To some degree. It's a destiny, though. There's some very, very important changes. Let me, before I say that, when you talked about the laws out there are some laws we're going to have to deal with. And in fact, this week I'm founding a new institute called the Institute for Space Law and Policy. And you'll be able to go to our website very soon, ISLAP, which we call the ISLP publicly, but we call SLAP privately. And we're going to be taking on two main areas at first. One is ITAR, which is a very paranoid set of government regulations that won't let Americans work with people overseas, and is really, really damaging all sorts of activity, including the sorts of research you associates are in that we are hardly allowed to interact with people on scientific projects. The other issue is we're going to deal with property rights so that people can eventually be able to own the land when they go out into space, and which is a major driver. And we want to handle that in a way that is different from in the past, that is tasteful, that is culturally beneficial, doesn't allow for too much speculation, but would support people who really put everything on the line to go somewhere by allowing them to homestead. Now, that having been said, and a few of your listeners probably freaking out of, oh my God, we're going to go do it all again in space. And, there are people I run into who say, oh, we've messed up the planet, how dare we go out and mess up space. I say to them, this is a different thing. First of all, hopefully we've learned a tiny bit. Second of all, we're not going somewhere where we're taking the land or space away from other people who we are, much to their chagrin, discovering. We're going out together this time. Interestingly, there will be Black and Chinese and Native Americans walking on the moon together this time. Another major point, that the existence of humanity on this planet has been characterized by an ongoing assault on the biosphere. As humanity and our industrialization has expanded, we have been in an attack mode on the ecosystem of the biosphere itself ever since we started. Opening space is the first time in human history where that process can be reversed, in that we will be expanding life, taking the species, plants, life of Earth with us to worlds that are now dead. That's an incredible destiny to have.
Absolutely.
In fact, I hate to use the word destiny, but because it's almost too passive.
Well, it would also be nice to see things like materials and mining, the real the development that creates a lot of our pollution moved off Earth, and hopefully over the next decades, once commercialization of space becomes economically feasible, we can realize Jerry Pournelle's dream to some extent of maybe remaking Earth into more of a park-like environment, and then moving some of these heavy polluters into space, where, to be honest, it's better financially. It's better for the environment.
Yeah, sometimes when I run into an environmentalist, a hardcore environmentalist, and I consider myself to be more of an environmentalist than almost anybody I've ever met as an environmentalist, because when you're talking about what we're talking about expanding the environment rather than putting Band-Aids and trying to save the current environment. We want to save it and expand it. Well, and I have the credentials. I went door to door for Greenpeace right out of college. And what I'd say is, somebody comes to me and they go, well, we're going to go out there and Sagan's quote at one point when he was attacking O'Neill was he said that O'Neill was a robber baron who wants to plunder and pillage God's pristine solar system. The fact is, I would say to a hardcore environmentalist, look, you can rip the heart out of a living mountain and the ecosystem and forests of that mountain and all the amphibian destruction that goes with that to mine metals out of that mountain. Or we can get those same metals from a dead rock floating in space. Now, you tell me which one of those is more environmentally sound.
Oh, sure.
It's a complete different equation, and people who are caught up in the traditional arguments on both sides, left, right, and center, all three, they have to switch gear. Because, and I hate to use the word, but in this case, it actually is one of those few cases where it totally applies. We are in a paradigm shift. This is the definition, if there ever was one, of a paradigm shift.
Absolutely.
At a level of Copernicus. So it's a very exciting time. I see an incredible future for us. I think as we begin to break out of the shell of Earth, we will also break out of our own psychologies and begin to look at humanity differently, physics, the universe, reality itself in a different mode. And the breakthroughs that people like yourselves and your listeners are working on will really begin to come to the fore. And so I urge people to stay involved, get active, do something. Don't just ramble on websites. Do something. Bend some metal. Do an experiment. Find somebody else. Show up at a lab and volunteer. Don't ramble and BS on the BBS. Get out there and do something and be a part of this revolution.
Absolutely. Well, we're almost out of time for today, and I want to say thank you for joining us. It's been a tremendous opportunity, and I'd like to close by listing your URLs. The first is the Space Frontier Foundation at www.space-frontier.org, and the second is your own homepage at www.ricktumlinson.com, and that's spelled RickTumlinson. Now,
I would add a third if you don't mind, and I will tell you my personal website is sort of an under construction filing cabinet. It's not really much of a fluff site, so there's not a lot there. But we will be going online with the ISLAP.org website in a couple of weeks. If you want to read about property rights and ITAR and some of these other legal issues coming down the road.
Okay, so that's ISLAP.org, and that really deals with property rights, as well as the space-frontier.org and ricktumlinson.com. Well, thanks again for your time, Rick.
Thank you very much. It's been fun, and I look forward to you guys pulling something off.
Thanks.